I killed my sister, not with a gun or a knife, with pills, OxyContin. To be exact, she was 28 years old, 3 years clean from opioid addiction, rebuilding her life. I was the person she trusted most in the world, and I systematically destroyed her recovery, placed pills where she'd find them, triggered her cravings, pushed her back into addiction. 8 months later, she died of an overdose in a trailer in West Virginia. I'm 33 years old, former opioid carrier for a prescription drug ring. I thought I was just delivering medicine. Then I discovered the pharmaceutical executive I worked for was running the largest pill mill operation in Appalachia, and when my sister accidentally learned about it, he gave me a choice: re-addict her or watch our entire family die. I chose to kill her slowly. Before I tell you how deep this corruption goes, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This confession will likely end my life. The pharmaceutical industry has billions of dollars and unlimited power to silence people who expose their crimes. Subscribe now, because what I'm about to reveal isn't just my story. It's the truth about how the opioid epidemic was deliberately manufactured by companies that profit from addiction. Every family destroyed by pills needs to hear this. I was born in 1991 in McDowell County, West Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia's coal country. By the time I was old enough to understand what poverty meant, the coal mines were already dying. My father had worked underground for 20 years until black lung forced him into disability. My mother cleaned houses for the few families in the county who still had money. We lived in a single wide trailer with holes in the floor that we covered with plywood and rugs. McDowell County wasn't just poor, it was a place America had forgotten. The median household income was under $25,000. Nearly half the population lived below the poverty line. There were no jobs beyond Walmart, fast food, and whatever drug trade the latest organization was running. The landscape was beautiful: rolling mountains, dense forests, but the economy was a corpse that nobody had bothered to bury. My sister Sarah was 5 years younger than me. We were close in the way siblings get close when they're all each other has. She was bright, funny, dreamed of becoming a veterinarian because she loved animals. But dreams require resources, and we had none. She graduated high school in 2009, right when the economy collapsed. There was no money for college, no jobs available, no path forward that didn't involve leaving everything she knew. Sarah got her wisdom teeth removed when she was 19. The dentist prescribed her 30 OxyContin pills for pain management. That prescription was the beginning of the end. Within 2 months, she was addicted. Within 6 months, she was buying pills on the street when her prescription ran out. Within a year, she'd lost her job at a gas station, moved back into our parents' trailer, and was deep in the nightmare of opioid dependency. I watched my sister deteriorate. The girl who'd wanted to save animals couldn't save herself. She tried to quit multiple times. Each attempt lasted days or weeks before the withdrawal became unbearable, and she'd find pills again. Our parents were heartbroken and helpless. My father's disability check and my mother's cleaning wages barely covered rent and food. There was no money for rehab, no resources for treatment beyond the overwhelmed county health clinic. By the time Sarah was 23, she'd overdosed twice. Both times, someone had found her in time, administered Narcan, brought her back. The second time, in the emergency room, a social worker told our mother that the next overdose would probably be fatal. Sarah needed serious intervention, inpatient treatment, months of therapy, medications to manage withdrawal. The cost would be tens of thousands of dollars. We might as well have been told she needed to go to the moon. I was 28, working as a driver for a regional carrier company, making barely enough to rent a room in a boarding house in Welch, the county seat. I felt powerless watching Sarah destroy herself. I wanted to help, but had no resources, no answers, no way to save her. Then I got offered a different kind of driving job. A man named Richard Caldwell approached me at a gas station. He was in his 50s, well dressed by local standards, drove a new pickup truck. He said he ran a medical supply distribution company and needed reliable drivers who knew the back roads of southern West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. The pay was 3 times what I was making. Cash. No questions asked about why certain deliveries needed to happen at odd hours, or why some packages couldn't go through normal shipping channels. I knew immediately it wasn't legitimate. But I also knew my sister was dying, my parents were drowning in debt, and I'd been poor my entire life. I took the job. The work was exactly what I'd suspected, delivering prescription opioids to pill mills disguised as pain management clinics. I'd pick up packages from a warehouse in Charleston, drive circuits through tiny Appalachian towns, drop off boxes at clinics that looked barely operational. The clinics would see hundreds of patients a day, writing prescriptions for OxyContin, Percocet, Vicodin, without real examinations. Patients would fill prescriptions at cooperating pharmacies, then sell most of the pills to dealers who'd distribute them across the region. It was an assembly line converting pharmaceutical products into street drugs. I told myself I was just a courier. I wasn't prescribing the pills, wasn't forcing anyone to take them, wasn't directly causing harm. These were lies I needed to believe to cash my paychecks. The money let me help my parents with rent, buy groceries, occasionally give Sarah cash when she was desperate. I was participating in the system destroying my community while using the proceeds to barely keep my family afloat. In 2019, something shifted in Sarah. She'd hit bottom so many times that she'd finally broken through to something else. Determination. She checked herself into a county detox program, suffered through withdrawal, started attending NI meetings religiously. She got on Suboxone to manage cravings. She moved into a sober living house in Beckley, 40 miles away from our hometown and its triggers. She got a job at Walmart, started rebuilding relationships with our parents, began saving money with dreams of taking veterinary assistant courses at the community college. For 3 years, Sarah stayed clean. It wasn't easy. She had relapses, moments of weakness, days where staying sober felt impossible. But she fought through them. By 2022, she'd moved into her own apartment, gotten promoted to department supervisor at Walmart, reconnected with her 4-year-old daughter, who'd been living with our parents. She was proof that recovery was possible, even in places where everything conspired against it. I was proud of her and ashamed of myself. While she'd been fighting for sobriety, I'd been delivering the pills that fed addictions like hers. The contradiction became unbearable. In early 2023, I told Richard Caldwell I was quitting. I'd saved some money, would find legitimate work, couldn't participate in this anymore. Richard's response was calm and chilling. He explained that I'd never been just a courier. For 4 years, I'd been involved in a criminal conspiracy that generated tens of millions of dollars annually. I knew routes, clinic locations, pharmacy contacts, delivery schedules. I was a witness who could destroy the entire operation if I decided to talk to law enforcement. People like me didn't just quit. They stayed until they were no longer useful, at which point they disappeared. But Richard was a reasonable businessman. He didn't want to eliminate me if it wasn't necessary, so he'd give me an incentive to stay loyal and quiet. My sister Sarah, he explained, had accidentally become a problem. She'd been working at the Walmart pharmacy and had noticed patterns in prescriptions, massive quantities of opioids, being failed repeatedly for the same patients from certain doctors. Being a recovering addict who understood the signs, she'd grown suspicious. She'd mentioned these concerns to a co-worker, who'd mentioned them to someone else, and eventually word had reached Richard's organization. Sarah hadn't done anything yet. She hadn't reported anything to authorities. She'd just asked questions, noticed patterns, but in Richard's risk assessment, she was a threat. Someone with knowledge, motivation, and nothing to lose who might eventually cause problems. The safest solution was elimination. Except Richard had learned something important about risk management in the pharmaceutical distribution business. Killing people attracts attention, investigations, consequences. Much better to neutralize threats through other means. And he'd identified the perfect solution for Sarah, re-addiction. If Sarah relapsed back into opioid addiction, she'd lose her job, her credibility, her stability. She'd become someone whose accusations could be dismissed as the paranoid ravings of an addict. Problem solved without violence. And I was going to be the weapon. As her brother, I had access, trust, and knowledge of her triggers and vulnerabilities. My job was simple. Over the next few months, systematically sabotage her recovery. Place pills where she'd find them. Create situations that stressed her sobriety. Be present during weak moments to enable, rather than support. Transform from protector to predator. Turn my sister back into an addict. If I refused, Richard would kill our entire family. Sarah, our parents, me, make it look like a murder-suicide, drug deal gone wrong, whatever story was convenient. He showed me surveillance photos of Sarah at work, our parents at their trailer, my daily routines. He demonstrated that he had the access and willingness to eliminate problems. If I cooperated, everyone would live. Sarah would relapse. Yes. She'd suffer. Yes. But she'd be alive to potentially recover again later. And my parents would be safe. It was harm versus death. And I convinced myself that harm was the ethical choice. I spent 3 days in hell making this decision. Every argument I constructed for cooperation was a rationalization. I knew that, but I also knew refusal would mean watching my family executed. The choice wasn't between good and evil. It was between different types of evil, and I chose the one that kept people breathing. The re-addiction process started gradually. I began visiting Sarah more often, rebuilding closeness after years of distance caused by my guilt about the career work. She was happy to reconnect, grateful that her brother was showing up for family dinners, helping with her daughter, being present. I used that trust as a weapon. The first pills were planted carefully. I hid OxyContin tablets in her apartment, during visits, in the bathroom cabinet behind other medications, in the kitchen drawer where she kept random items, in coat pockets. Not where she'd find them immediately, but where she'd discover them during normal life. The goal was making her think she'd forgotten about pills from her using days, creating the illusion that drugs were just around, available, calling to her. When Sarah found the first pills, she called me panicked. She didn't know where they'd come from, was terrified they'd trigger her cravings, wanted me to come get rid of them. I took them away, assured her it was probably just old pills she'd forgotten about, told her she was strong enough to handle it. I was supportive brother while planting seeds of doubt about her environment's safety. I escalated slowly over the following weeks. I placed pills in new locations. I befriended people in her NA group and learned her trigger situations, financial stress, relationship problems, work anxiety. Then I engineered these situations. I borrowed money from her and didn't repay it, creating financial pressure. I introduced chaos into her routine with my requests and presents. I was there during her vulnerable moments, not to support her recovery, but to subtly undermine it. 3 months into the process, Sarah started looking worn down, the constant low-level stress, the mysterious pills appearing, the feeling that her sobriety was under siege. It was exhausting her. Her meeting attendance became spotty. She stopped calling her sponsor regularly. Small cracks appeared in her recovery foundation. Then I moved to active enabling. When Sarah mentioned she was stressed, I suggested maybe one pill wouldn't hurt, that she'd been clean so long she could probably handle it. When she resisted, I left pills somewhere she'd find them during a particularly difficult day. I normalized the idea of using again, framed it as understandable, given her circumstances, positioned myself as someone who wouldn't judge if she needed relief. 5 months in, Sarah relapsed. She found pills I'd planted, had a terrible day at work, and took 2 OxyContin tablets. The guilt afterward was crushing. She called me crying, devastated that she'd broken her sobriety. I comforted her, told her it was a slip, not a fall, that she could get back on track, while privately continuing to ensure pills remained available and stress remained high. One relapse became 2, became 5, became daily use. Sarah tried to hide it, tried to maintain her job and apartment and custody of her daughter, while spiraling back into addiction. But opioid addiction doesn't allow functional use forever. Within 2 months of that first relapse, she'd been fired from Walmart for showing up impaired. Within 3 months, she'd lost her apartment. Within 4 months, our parents had custody of her daughter again, and Sarah was back in the cycle she'd fought so hard to escape. I watched this happen. I caused this to happen. Every day I saw my sister deteriorating, saw the person she'd become dissolving back into the addict she'd been. The worst part was that she still trusted me. I was one of the few people she'd let close during her relapse. She'd call me when she was dope sick, when she needed money, when she was desperate, and I'd respond like a caring brother while making sure the addiction continued. Richard was satisfied with my work. He paid me bonuses for successful completion of the assignment. Sarah was no longer a threat. She was back to being a struggling addict, whose observations about prescription patterns could be dismissed as paranoid delusions from someone who'd relapsed. Problem solved through psychological warfare instead of violence. Sarah died 8 months after her first relapse, 14 months after I'd started the re-addiction process. She overdosed alone in a trailer she'd been staying in near Bluefield. Someone found her the next morning. The coroner's report said she'd taken a combination of OxyContin and fentanyl, street pills that looked pharmaceutical, but were actually pressed with deadly doses of synthetic opioids. She was 28 years old. I got the call from my mother. Her screaming on the phone is a sound I'll carry forever. Sarah had fought so hard, had been clean for 3 years, had rebuilt her life, and then she'd relapsed and died. My mother couldn't understand what had happened, why Sarah had gone back to using after being sober so long. She kept asking if I knew what had triggered the relapse, if I'd seen warning signs, if I could have done something differently. I lied to my grieving mother and said I didn't know, that addiction was unpredictable, that Sarah had fought bravely, but the disease was too strong. I attended my sister's funeral and accepted condolences from people who had no idea I was responsible for the person in the casket. After Sarah's funeral, I tried to quit again. Told Richard I'd done what he'd asked, neutralized the threat, but couldn't continue working for the organization. Richard's response was predictable. I now had even more evidence of criminal activity, not just drug distribution, but premeditated re-addiction and indirect homicide. I was more of a liability than ever. The only thing keeping me alive was continued cooperation and silence. He offered me a promotion. Instead of just career work, I'd help manage logistics for the entire regional operation. Better pay, more responsibility, deeper involvement in the conspiracy. Or I could refuse and join Sarah in the cemetery. Richard showed me an envelope with photos of Sarah's deterioration over the 8 months. Clear documentation of my involvement if I ever decided to talk. I took the promotion. What else could I do? Refusing meant death. Going to law enforcement meant implicating myself in my sister's death, and probably getting killed before trial. Running meant leaving my parents vulnerable to retaliation. I was trapped by my earlier choice to cooperate, by the evidence Richard had of my participation, by the system that turns people into weapons against their own families. For the next 18 months, I worked deeper inside the operation. I learned the full scope of what Richard actually was, not just a regional distributor, but a logistics manager for a much larger pharmaceutical diversion scheme run by Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician who owned a network of pain management clinics across West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Webb had legitimate medical credentials, sat on state medical boards, testified before Congress about opioid abuse prevention. He was the respectable face of pain management while running a massive criminal enterprise. The operation was brilliantly constructed. Webb's clinics would see thousands of patients monthly, writing prescriptions for enormous quantities of opioids. These prescriptions were technically legal. They came from licensed doctors at legitimate clinics. But the medical examinations were shams, the diagnoses were fabricated, and the prescriptions were written specifically to feed the black market. Patients would fill prescriptions at pharmacies that were either complicit or overwhelmed, then sell most of the pills to networks of dealers. The dealers would distribute throughout Appalachia and beyond. Dr. Webb made millions in clinic fees and kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies happy to sell massive quantities of drugs with minimal questions. The dealers made millions reselling the pills. The patients got a small cut and access to drugs to feed their own addictions. And people like me kept the logistics running smoothly, making deliveries, managing schedules, ensuring the assembly line operated efficiently. The opioid epidemic wasn't an accident or an unintended consequence of pain management. It was a business model. Companies manufactured demand through aggressive marketing. Doctors prescribed irresponsibly for profit. Distributors moved product. And dealers sold to addicts the system had created. Then those same companies funded addiction treatment centers, making money on both ends of the cycle. Create the disease, sell the treatment, repeat. I saw communities destroyed systematically. In McDowell County alone, the overdose death rate was among the highest in the nation. Families were shattered. Children ended up in foster care. Entire towns became graveyards of abandoned buildings and traumatized people. And the money flowed upward to pharmaceutical executives, clinic owners, and investors who never touched a pill or saw the bodies their business model created. Sarah was just one casualty in this war, a war where one side had armies of lawyers, billions in capital, and regulatory capture that made them essentially untouchable. And I'd become a soldier for the wrong side, killing my own people, including my sister. In August 2024, federal authorities began investigating Dr. Webb's network. A DEA task force had been building a case for 2 years, tracking prescription patterns, analyzing data, connecting distribution networks. The investigation was comprehensive. They had evidence of fraud, conspiracy, money laundering across multiple states. Richard found out through his law enforcement contacts. The response was immediate cleanup. Shredding documents, wiping servers, eliminating witnesses, who might cooperate with investigators. I was on the elimination list. After Sarah's death, after managing logistics for 18 months, after knowing too much about too many operations, I'd become a security risk with diminishing utility. I found out I was marked for elimination because another logistics manager, someone who'd worked with Richard longer than I had, warned me. He didn't do it from altruism. He did it because my disappearance would draw attention during a sensitive period when federal agents were watching. Easier to let me run and clean me up later, after investigations had cooled. I had maybe 48 hours. I took the cash I'd saved, about $70,000 in blood money from killing my sister and helping destroy communities. I grabbed essential documents and one photograph of Sarah from before addiction had marked her. I told my parents I'd gotten a job opportunity in Tennessee and needed to leave immediately. I couldn't tell them the truth, that I'd killed their daughter, that I was running from people who'd kill them if I stayed. I drove to Nashville, Tennessee, about 5 hours south. It was big enough to disappear in, but close enough I could reach my parents if necessary. I rented an apartment under a partially fake identity, real first name, fake last name, cash payments for 6 months up front. For 9 months, I've lived in limbo. I work minimum wage jobs, warehouse work, food service, anything that pays cash and doesn't ask questions. I avoid social contact. I wait to see if they'll find me or decide I'm not worth the effort. Every day is waiting for death while carrying Sarah's ghost. They found me last week. Not Richard's people, federal agents, the DEA task force investigating Dr. Webb's network had followed financial trails that led to Richard's operation, which led to logistics managers, which led to me. They knocked on my door with a choice: cooperate with their investigation and enter witness protection, or face charges for conspiracy, drug distribution, and potentially manslaughter related to overdose deaths I'd facilitated. The agents showed me evidence they'd already compiled. They had transaction records, surveillance footage, testimony from other witnesses. They knew about my courier work, my logistics management, even had circumstantial evidence suggesting my involvement in Sarah's relapse. They'd built cases against Dr. Webb, Richard, and dozens of others in the network, but they needed insider testimony to make the charges stick, to prove the intentional nature of the operation, to demonstrate it wasn't just negligence, but deliberate criminal conspiracy. If I cooperated, I'd get immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony. I'd enter witness protection, new identity, new location, stipend to start over. My parents would be offered protection too, if they wanted it. The only cost would be testifying against everyone I'd worked with, exposing the entire operation, and reliving Sarah's death in court while explaining my role in it. If I refused, I'd face decades in federal prison. The charges they had were solid enough to convict even without my cooperation. And Richard's people would likely kill me before trial anyway. Cooperation was survival. Refusal was prolonged death. I'm testifying. The trial starts next month. Dr. Marcus Webb, Richard Caldwell, and 37 others are facing federal charges for operating what prosecutors are calling the largest pharmaceutical diversion scheme in Appalachian history. The trial is expected to last 3 months. My testimony will likely be the most damaging because I was inside the logistics operation and can describe the intentional nature of the distribution network. I'm 33 years old. I killed my sister by re-addicting her to opioids on orders from the criminal organization I worked for. I participated in a conspiracy that fed the opioid epidemic, destroyed families, and turned communities into graveyards. The federal government is offering me immunity in exchange for testimony, but no immunity will clean the blood from my hands. This confession is the only act of honesty I have left. I'm recording this before entering witness protection, before I become someone else with a different name in a different place. The trial will expose the mechanics of pharmaceutical crime, but this confession exposes something deeper: how the opioid epidemic was manufactured for profit, how poor communities were systematically addicted, how people like me became weapons against our own families. Sarah wanted to be a veterinarian. She wanted to save animals. She fought for 3 years to save herself from addiction, and I destroyed her recovery, fed her pills, pushed her back into the nightmare she'd escaped. She died thinking she'd failed, thinking her addiction had beaten her. She never knew that her brother had been the source of her relapse, that I'd been paid to kill her slowly, that her death was murder disguised as overdose. If this story opened your eyes to how the opioid epidemic really works, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this everywhere. The pharmaceutical industry corrupt doctors, and distribution networks like the one I worked for depend on silence, on everyone looking away, on addiction being blamed on weak individuals, instead of the corporations that manufactured the epidemic for profit. Your subscription matters because it pushes this truth to more people. Hit that like button. Every like helps this story reach families destroyed by opioids, communities fighting addiction, investigators building cases against pharmaceutical criminals. The algorithm doesn't care about justice, but it responds to engagement. Force people to see how the epidemic was created, who profits from it, how companies turned poverty into addiction, into profit. My sister is dead because I chose survival over her life. The opioid epidemic killed her, but I was the delivery mechanism. Pharmaceutical executives made billions while communities like ours died. Doctors prescribed poison while testifying about drug abuse prevention. And people like me, desperate, trapped, compromised, became the weapons they used to destroy our own families. My real name is Daniel Reed. Sarah Reed was my sister. She was 28 years old when she died of an opioid overdose I caused. Dr. Marcus Webb, Richard Caldwell, and dozens of others will face trial for their roles in the epidemic. But the real criminals, the pharmaceutical companies that manufactured the crisis, the executives who knew what they were doing, the system that profits from addiction, they'll never face justice. If you're struggling with opioid addiction, or know someone who is, understand that it's not your weakness or their failure. It's a disease that was deliberately created and spread for profit. Recovery is possible, but the system is designed to keep you addicted. Don't let them win. Fight for recovery the way Sarah fought. She made it 3 years. It's possible. And if you're working for operations like the one I worked for, understand that you're a tool that will be discarded. They'll use you to destroy others, then destroy you. The money isn't worth it. The cooperation isn't survival. It's just delayed death. Get out before they make you kill someone you love. Sarah, I'm sorry. I know you'll never read this, never hear this, never know how you really died. But I'm sorry for what I did, for choosing wrong, for being too weak to refuse even when refusing meant dying. You deserved a brother who would die for you, not one who killed you to stay alive.